Good day, students. Today we're going to look at Unit 3, so we're chipping along here, managing in a global environment. I really hope that you actually did watch the video on globalization, as it does sort of set the stage for this next unit. Alright, so to jump right in, it's said that we're living in a borderless world, or the world is becoming a global village, and I'm sure you're all feeling that. Business is becoming a unified global field. And basically, companies that actually think globally are said to have a competitive edge. Obviously, they're able to reach more customers and possibly able to access best practices, etc. Sometimes when we actually purchase, we may not be able to tell from which country we are buying because we don't actually know who is producing what we buy, adding to this borderless world that we're living in. So how may businesses operate globally? This is what's known as the 4 stages of globalization, and they are as follows. An organization may act domestically or being domestic. This is when their market potential is limited to their home country. All their production and marketing facilities are located at home. So an example we can provide for this is maybe Japs Fried Chicken, I think they're called. They only exist in Trinidad. They produce all chicken, etc. in Trinidad, and they market to a Trinidadian market. So they are a domestic organization. Second, we have international. And basically, this is when the organization starts to export its product or service. So it produces it all in Trinidad, but it markets its products differently. So maybe an example, I can't actually think of an example right now, but let's say an organization exports, let's say there's an organization that makes snacks and they export these snacks. So all these snacks are produced in Trinidad, but they export them. That means they are international. The third one is multinational. So they have marketing and production facilities in many different countries. More than 1/3 of its sales actually happens from outside the country. So maybe if we thought of Carib Beer. Now Carib actually have a brewery in Grenada and St. Lucia. So that means they have production facilities in Trinidad as well as up the island. So they would be seen to be multinational. And then finally we have global stateless, which basically means that it seems that the business transcends any single home country. They seem to exist everywhere. Now, this is an interesting terminology here because often we hear multinational companies say that they operate globally. And that makes sense. They operate all over the world. But when we talk about the 4 stages of globalization and we say an organization is global, it tends to mean that we can't actually locate which country this organization is based from. So there's no real head office. They just exist all over. So maybe an example might be the United Nations, maybe a not-for-profit organization where you can't actually say where their head office is, compared with a multinational where you can probably very likely say where the head office is. So once again, these are the 4 stages of globalization. The international business environment. What does this actually mean? Anytime we are operating in more than one country, then we are managing internationally. Now, the basic management functions don't change. We still have to plan, if you remember from the first unit, plan and lead and monitor and organize. This happens regardless if it's international or domestic. However, of course, there's much more risk involved and much more complexity when we're managing globally. So what do we need to consider if we would like to operate in another country? Well, basically, it's almost back to a pestle analysis again, but there are 3 areas we really do have to focus on: economic, legal, political, and sociological. And in particular, we're going to look at some of these factors. So under economic, you'll see a number of headings. We're going to take you through all of those. So let's start now. Let's start with economic development. How developed is the country you are considering operating in? Obviously, some countries are seen to be more developed than others. This would have an impact based on the following. So infrastructure is a big one. The physical facilities that may support the economic activities. So, as basic as it may sound, are there airports? Can you get in and out easily? Are there highways or roads or trains that can actually help you move through the country? What about their energy producing facilities? Sometimes, in fact, in a lot of countries, electricity is a very, very high percentage of people's costs. In Trinidad and Tobago, this is actually very low. In some countries, they can actually produce enough electricity for the whole country. And then communication facilities. Is there internet? Is there Wi-Fi? How fast is it? Are people able to call each other easily? These things would obviously impact where you consider to run your business. The resource markets, the product markets. Obviously, if a product is in high demand in Trinidad, that does not necessarily mean it's going to be in high demand in another country. So first of all, you need to evaluate if there's a market demand or a demand for your product. And then, are there other resources available? Are there raw materials? Do you have adequate labor and skilled labor to actually assist in running this business in another country? If there were no raw materials and no labor with the skills you need, then you yourselves would have to spend a lot more money getting that raw material into that country. Exchange rates is a big deal. And if the exchange rate keeps fluctuating, well, all your planning and budgeting is out the window. And how do you actually be able to keep on top of this? All right, so we can move on a little bit. In fact, you know what we could actually add under exchange rates is just, as we know in Trinidad, the availability of foreign currency. Okay, so that was economical. We can now look at legal and political environment, and you can often see why legal and political are put together, yeah? So first of all, political risk. Are there any activities by the current government that could include people basically, or not people, organizations losing their assets or their earning power, managerial control? Is it possible government may take over? Could acts of violence hurt your country? There's no doubt that riots, revolutions, or even if a country decides to, take over its government, that could affect your business. So how stable is the political climate? In Trinidad, we are seen to be a very stable political climate, but as we know, there are a lot of countries that are not so stable. Laws and regulations are a big deal. Big deal. The laws in Trinidad and Tobago do not hold for the rest of the world. So the laws and regulations differ from country to country, and you need to know what the laws and regulations are. Obviously, the internet would be a good place to start, but sometimes the only way to actually know some of the basic laws and regulations is to be in that country and do the research yourself. And then, of course, the socio-cultural environment. Culture, and in this time we're talking not about corporate culture so much, but about the national culture and identity. And obviously cultures differ. You need to understand the culture and the societal norms and values of that organization that you're going to. In some cases, it may be as basic as language. People don't speak the same language. Religion might be very different. Religion might be more involved, or rather government and religion might be more interlinked. What are people's attitudes, their work ethic? How are people organized socially? What is the level of education in this country? All specific things you would need to consider if you're operating in another organization. In another country. In some cases, there may be different languages. How do you decide which one you're going to use? And then an interesting one, ethnocentrism. Do you regard your own culture as superior? So, for example, just an example, but we might have an American company coming to Trinidad who decide that, they do things much better than Trinidadians do, and they sort of have a superiority attitude. Or maybe we as Trinidadians and Tobagonians also do that. We think that our culture is superior. We have to be very wary of this when we're operating in the international or global front. So just very briefly, some of you would be aware that there are international trade agreements, and most of these basically came out because of some of the legal and political factors that people had to face. So here are just a few. Most of us would be familiar with the World Trade Organization or the European Union, especially as the UK had pulled out. We also have the North American Free Trade Agreement, and of course right here in the Caribbean, the CARICOM. So trade agreements do help to set the framework for how countries do trade. What else should we look at? How can businesses actually enter the global market? So if you are managing an organization, how can you operate globally. So here are some strategies that you may outsource or globally outsource, which means you might take an element of your business and outsource it to another country, usually because it's cheaper to do so and definitely more efficient. So sometimes you may call a toll-free number or 800 number and you know that's not no Trini answering the phone. That business has basically outsourced maybe their call centers to another country, Jamaica, maybe even India. You don't often think of that as a way of doing business internationally, but you sure are. The one that we're probably most familiar with is exporting, when basically we're producing all our goods in Trinidad and Tobago, but we export to another country. That immediately means we're operating on the global front. Another one is licensing. So here we might have a corporation who would be known as the licensor. They make their resources available to a company in another country known as the licensee. So only that licensee is allowed to produce and sell the products. So they may offer resources such as technology, patent, trademark rights. And basically the licensee can produce the product that the licensor has been producing. Franchising, which many of us are familiar with, is a form of licensing in which basically a foreign franchise is given a complete package of products and services and materials, resources, secret recipes even, and they basically have to follow those terms and conditions. Of course, a licensing fee is paid, or a franchising fee, and also sometimes the licensor, the franchisor, takes a percentage of sales. But again, a simple way of operating globally. So we're getting a bit more complex here. Direct investment. So here's when a company is actually involved in managing production in a foreign country. So let's say our home country is Trinidad and we actually want to manage production facilities in a foreign country. We may go into a joint venture or a partnership with an organization that already exists in that country, because obviously they would be familiar with everything that goes on. It's often the less risky way of entering the international market. Or we could have a wholly owned foreign affiliate. So that's when our organization owns a foreign subsidiary. We have complete control. So possibly, if we look at the example of Carib having a brewery in Grenada, that brewery may be known as, let's just say, Carib Grenada. That might be a subsidiary of the overall Carib, overall Anson McAl. And then a greenfield venture is literally when we build a production facility from scratch. So literally there's a greenfield, and when we're finished with our facility, there's now a production facility. So this little graph basically shows, it looks at how much it costs to enter the foreign market versus how much ownership we have. So if we start on the greenfield venture up at the top, obviously it's going to cost us a lot to produce an entire facility, but we will own all of it. If we acquire a facility, again, it might not cost as much, but we'll own slightly less. Joint venturing and franchising is somewhere in the middle, but if we come to the complete other end, if we're just exporting our products, it's not costing us much, but we don't own any of the foreign operations. So just a different way of looking at things. So what additional skills must a manager possess within a global environment? Well, he definitely needs to be aware of culture and the different subtleties or the different slight differences in culture. Be aware that he may go through a culture shock. All the basic functions of management stay the same, but he must be able to be culturally flexible and easily to adapt to new situations. Obviously, in this day and age, he's maybe expected to know more than one language, and definitely maybe even have already be familiar with the country he's working in. Maybe, maybe not. The main thing is to be aware culturally of how things differ. And of course, all the research you can on the economic PESTLE, the whole PESTLE, the economic, socio-cultural, technological, especially as it relates to the laws of the country. And that is this presentation finished.